Hello everyone and welcome back to Panic Peak. Let me know where you are listening from in the world by leaving a comment, and if you like the episode, please like and subscribe. Now, let's get cozy, and let's begin. When Emily and I decided to leave the city, we dreamed of a quieter life, a peaceful retreat from the constant buzz of urban noise. We found the perfect place, a quiet, suburban neighborhood, nestled in a sleepy town where the air felt cleaner, the streets were lined with trees, and the homes sat in neat rows, like something out of a postcard. It was the kind of place you imagine raising a family, where everyone knew each other and greeted one another with a smile. At first, everything seemed perfect. We moved into a charming little house on Maple Street, unpacked our boxes, and marveled at how serene our new life felt. The house was old but cozy, with creaky floors and faded wallpaper, everything we could have hoped for in a home. The yard was spacious, with enough room for a garden I had long dreamed of cultivating. There were no loud car alarms, no honking horns, just the soft rustling of leaves in the wind. It was the dream we had been longing for, until the silence began to settle in. The first night, it was a subtle thing. We closed the windows and pulled the curtains, settling in for bed. But as the darkness fell, something felt off. The street outside our house, which had looked so lively during the day, was eerily still. Not a single light flickered from any of the neighboring homes. It felt like the entire block had been swallowed by the night, as though the houses themselves were holding their breath. "Maybe everyone's just in bed early," Emily said, her voice laced with a hint of unease. But I wasn't so sure. It wasn't just the absence of lights. It was the absence of everything. No dogs barking in the distance, no faint hum of a television from behind a window, just an unsettling, oppressive silence. The next day, I tried to push the strange feeling aside. We unpacked more boxes and took a walk around the neighborhood to familiarize ourselves with the area. The houses were all the same, neat, identical, with manicured lawns and perfectly trimmed hedges. Yet, as we walked, something felt wrong. Every house we passed was dark. No lights, no flicker of movement. I waved at a few windows, hoping someone would notice us, but there was nothing. No one appeared behind the glass, no shadows shifting. The windows stared back at us like hollow eyes. "Maybe they're just really private," Emily said, trying to offer an explanation, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing, something important. That night, we decided to meet some of the neighbors. After dinner, we donned our jackets and walked across the street to the house next door. The couple that lived there were elderly, but their house was pristine, just like all the others. We rang the doorbell, smiling, hoping for a warm welcome. A woman with graying hair and soft, kind eyes answered the door. At least, I thought she had kind eyes, until I noticed the way she looked at us, distantly, as if we were strangers, though we had just introduced ourselves. She didn't smile, didn't ask how we were settling in. Her gaze seemed distant, as if lost in a faraway thought. "Good evening," I said, trying to break the silence. "We're your new neighbors, just moved in next door." She nodded slowly, her eyes not quite meeting mine. "Yes," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "I see." It was an odd exchange. I smiled, hoping for a bit of warmth, but it didn't come. There was no invitation to chat, no interest in how we were finding the neighborhood. Just that vacant stare. "Well, we just wanted to say hello," I said awkwardly. "I'm Mark, and this is Emily." "Yes," she replied, the same distant tone, "I know." And with that, she gently closed the door without another word. I turned to Emily, my confusion mirrored in her face. "That was strange," she whispered. She didn't even say goodbye. The next few days passed in much the same way. Every neighbor we approached was the same, polite but distant, responding with short, unengaged answers before retreating into their homes. It was as though everyone was going through the motions of normal life but had forgotten how to live it. The silence continued to stretch its grip on the neighborhood. Not a single light ever flickered on at night. We began to feel like we were living in a ghost town. I told myself it was just our imagination running wild, that we were adjusting to a slower pace of life. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. And then, it started. The whispers. At first, it was just a faint rustling sound behind the walls. I thought it was the wind, or maybe the house settling, but each night it grew louder. It was subtle at first, just a murmur, a scraping noise from deep within the house. But soon it was impossible to ignore. The sounds weren't random. They were voices. Whispers. As if someone, something, was speaking just beyond the reach of comprehension. "Can you hear that?" I asked Emily one night, my voice barely above a whisper. She frowned. "What are you talking about?" "The voices. They're in the walls." She shook her head. "You're just tired, Mark. It's probably the pipes. Old houses do that." But I knew it wasn't just the pipes. I could hear the whispers clearly, muffled yet urgent, like words meant for my ears only. "Leave." One voice hissed, barely audible, but it sent a chill crawling down my spine. I shook it off, though I couldn't deny the growing unease that clung to me. That night, the whispers seemed to echo in every room of the house. I tried to block them out, tried to focus on something, anything, else, but it was impossible. The walls were alive with their murmurs. The next day, I couldn't take it any longer. I needed to speak to someone, anyone, to understand what was happening. Maybe if I could just confront the neighbors, they would explain it. Maybe they could tell me it was normal, just some weird, isolated quirk of the house or the town. I went to the house across the street, an elderly couple that had been living there as long as anyone could remember. I knocked on the door, heart pounding with a mix of dread and hope. But when the door opened, my hope shattered. The man and woman who lived there stood in the doorway, their faces expressionless. They didn't greet me, didn't acknowledge me in any way. Just stared. I cleared my throat, trying to remain calm. "Hi, I'm Mark from next door. We just moved in." You shouldn't have come," the woman whispered, her voice rasping like dry leaves. She didn't step aside, didn't invite me in. I took a step back. "What do you mean?" "They're listening," she said, her eyes widening in terror. "The walls, they'll take you too." I turned and ran back to my house, panic surging through my veins. I couldn't process what had just happened, what they meant. But as I turned to glance back at the house, I saw them, watching me, their eyes hollow, unmoving. That night, the whispers were louder, more frantic. I could hear them clearly now. "Leave, before it's too late." I couldn't sleep, couldn't escape the feeling that the walls were closing in around me. I had to know what was going on, had to confront whatever haunted this place. I went to the attic, armed with a flashlight, determined to find the source of the sounds. But as I stepped into the cramped space, something stopped me, a cold draft, an unnatural chill. And there, in the corner of the room, I saw it. A small door, half hidden behind a stack of old boxes. It wasn't there before. It had never been there. The whispers grew louder, clearer, as if they were coming from beyond that door. I reached for the handle. And just as my fingers brushed against it, a voice, louder than the rest, whispered, "You're already too late." Before I could react, the door swung open by itself, revealing nothing but blackness. The whispers rose to a crescendo, and I felt a presence behind me, as if the very walls of the house were alive with hunger. Then, in the blink of an eye, I was consumed. Swallowed whole by the darkness. It's been days, maybe weeks, since that night. The house is silent again, but the whispers have never stopped. They are here, inside me now, echoing in my mind. And when I look into the empty, vacant eyes of my neighbors, I can feel the weight of their gaze. I know what they've become. I know what I'm becoming. The silence is no longer just outside. It's within. The walls are waiting. I had never been one to believe in the supernatural. My life was simple, routine, nothing out of the ordinary. I had my job, my quiet apartment, and a phone that stayed mostly silent. But everything changed one night when I received a phone call at exactly midnight. It wasn't strange at first. People get calls at odd hours sometimes. Maybe it was a wrong number, or a telemarketer trying their luck at a late-night pitch. But then it happened again the next night, and the next, at the same time. That's when the unease started. At first, I thought it was a prank. A sick joke. Maybe one of my friends had decided to mess with me, setting an alarm to make sure they could call and scare me at the same time every night. I could almost hear them laughing on the other end, imagining the way I'd jump at the sudden ring. But after the third night, when the phone rang again without warning, I started to feel a pit form in my stomach. The caller ID was always just an unknown number, no name attached. And when I picked up, there was only silence, long, drawn-out silence that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It was as if the caller was waiting for something, waiting for me to say something, but I never did. I couldn't. Each time I'd hang up, my hand would shake. I'd lie back down, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of it. Maybe I was just being paranoid. Maybe it was a coincidence. But then came the first time I saw it. A shadow. Outside my window. It was brief at first, a fleeting glimpse that I thought might have been my imagination running wild. But no. The figure was too solid, too distinct to ignore. It was tall, but not humanoid, more like a shifting mass of darkness that loomed just beyond the glass. It disappeared as soon as I looked, vanishing into the night. My heart raced, my palms clammy as I quickly pulled the curtains closed, trying to convince myself it was just the reflection of a tree in the wind. But that night, sleep didn't come. I lay in bed, staring at the wall, the phone on my nightstand mocking me. Was it possible someone was watching me? Someone who could see me, waiting for me to fall asleep, just so they could torment me? I thought of all the movies and stories about stalkers, about the insane possibilities people never talk about. The ones that make you look over your shoulder when you walk home in the dark. My stomach churned. The phone rang again at midnight. I didn't answer it. I couldn't. But I couldn't stop myself from looking out the window, half expecting the figure to reappear. The seconds ticked by like hours as the ringing continued, filling the silence, loud in the emptiness of my apartment. Finally, it stopped. I waited. I stared at the window, my heart pounding. It felt like the figure had been waiting too, waiting for me to acknowledge it, to open the door to whatever it was that was now haunting me. And then I saw it. The figure was there again. This time, it was clearer. Not a shifting blur in the dark, but a solid shape, dark and almost humanoid in form. It had no features, no discernible face. But the air around it seemed thicker, as if the darkness it cast was clinging to the walls of my room, suffocating the light. The figure stood motionless, its presence pressing against the glass, as though it were waiting for something, waiting for me. I couldn't look away. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to flee, but my legs wouldn't move. I was paralyzed. I finally forced myself to turn away. The figure vanished the moment I looked back at the room, but the fear lingered. I was shaking, drenched in sweat. I picked up the phone, but this time I couldn't just hang up. I dialed the police, but after a few rings, I stopped myself. What would I even say? That someone was calling me at midnight every night, and a shadowy figure was standing outside my window afterward? They'd think I was insane. I'd think I was insane. The phone rang again. Midnight. I picked it up this time, but there was still nothing on the other end. No voice, no sound, just the hiss of static. And then, just like clockwork, the call ended. I dropped the phone, heart hammering, eyes darting to the window. It was closer now. The figure had moved. It was no longer just standing there, it was walking along the edge of my window, like it knew exactly where I was. Its presence felt like a thick fog, surrounding me, trapping me inside this apartment. I pressed myself against the wall, breathing heavily, praying I wasn't seeing things. And then it stopped. The figure stood still, inches from the glass, and for a long moment, I thought I could see its eyes, hollow, dark voids that seemed to pull at the very essence of my soul. But when I blinked, they were gone. The phone rang again. This time, I didn't wait. I grabbed it quickly, but the voice on the other end wasn't human. It was a hiss, a low rasp that seemed to rattle my bones, shaking me to my core. I couldn't make out the words, but I heard something, something close. Something like a growl, low and menacing, vibrating through the receiver. I've been waiting. I froze. The whisper was so soft, so chilling, that I could feel it scrape across my skin, like fingers dragging down my spine. Suddenly, the door rattled. A sharp bang, followed by the creaking of floorboards. My heart stopped. There was no one else in the apartment. I lived alone. But the sound was unmistakable, someone, or something, was in the house. I stood motionless, terror paralyzing me. The figure was no longer outside. It was inside now. With shaking hands, I checked the locks. Everything was secure. But the whispers didn't stop. They were getting louder now, echoing through the apartment, around me, beneath me, above me. I could hear the figure moving through the darkness. But it wasn't alone anymore. The phone rang again. Midnight. The door creaked open, and there it stood. The figure. But this time, it was no longer just a shadow. Its form was more solid, its eyes piercing through the darkness, its mouth twisted in an empty grin. The room seemed to shrink as it stepped forward, its presence overwhelming. I could no longer see anything but it. The silence in my apartment was deafening, save for the rhythmic ringing of the phone that echoed in my skull. "I've been waiting for you." The whisper came again, closer this time, the voice so familiar, so final. And in that moment, I understood. The calls had never been random. The figure had always been waiting, for me, for this moment. It had been calling me, drawing me in with every ring, with every silent threat. And now, it was here. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My throat was dry, constricted by the fear that was choking me from the inside. The figure stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate, as though savoring every second of my terror. The temperature in the room dropped, my breath becoming visible in the air, but I couldn't move. The figure loomed over me, its hollow eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that felt as though it could peel back layers of my soul. "I've been waiting for you," it whispered again, this time so close I could feel its cold breath on my face, the words curling around me like a thick fog. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream. But all I could do was stare, rooted in place by something far more terrifying than mere fear, something primal, something ancient that told me I was already lost. The room seemed to close in around me, the walls pressing tighter, the shadows bending and stretching in unnatural ways. The figure reached out with long, elongated fingers, brushing the air in front of me, and with each movement, the darkness grew thicker, swallowing up every shred of light in the room. It was almost as if the darkness itself was alive, feeding off the fear that poured from me in waves. And then, as quickly as it had started, everything stopped. The figure disappeared. The room returned to its normal size, the oppressive weight lifted from the air, and the temperature rose back to its normal, mundane chill. The phone fell silent. The ringing had ceased. For a moment, I stood frozen, my mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened. Was it real? Was I dreaming? The world around me felt wrong, distorted, as if the boundaries between the living and the dead had blurred in that brief, horrifying moment. But as I looked toward the window, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, pressed against the glass, was a single handprint, a dark, smudged outline, like it had been left behind by the figure's touch. And it was slowly, ever so slowly, beginning to fade. I turned and rushed toward the door, ready to leave, to run as far from this nightmare as possible. But the door wouldn't open. It was locked. I fumbled with the handle, panic clawing at my chest. I was trapped. The phone rang again. Midnight. I looked at the screen, but this time there was no unknown number. No silence. Instead, the name that flashed on the screen made my blood run cold. "I've been waiting for you." The whisper from the phone echoed in my mind. I was no longer just the victim of the calls. I was the one they had been waiting for. And this time, there was no escape. The figure wasn't just outside anymore. It had followed me in. And it wasn't going away. We'd been planning this camping trip for weeks. It was supposed to be an escape, a chance to get away from the noise of city life and reconnect with nature, with each other. A simple, carefree weekend in the woods, just like the old days. There were 5 of us, me, Ryan, Zoe, Alex, and Emma. We'd been best friends since high school, but as life went on, we drifted apart, college, careers, relationships. This trip was supposed to bring us back together, to remind us of who we were before everything got complicated. The drive was long, but we were excited, full of jokes and laughter as we headed deep into the forest. We found the perfect spot by a small, winding river, its water clear and cold. The air smelled fresh, earthy, the scent of pine needles and damp moss. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the clearing as we unpacked and set up camp. We joked about how we were roughing it, even though we had plenty of gear, tents, sleeping bags, a cooler full of food and drinks. Everything felt easy and light, like it always had when we were younger. But as the sun began to set, something shifted. The woods grew eerily quiet. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the usual rustling of leaves, the chirping of birds, the sounds of the forest just stopped. I looked around, unease creeping in. The trees, tall and ancient, stood still as sentinels, their gnarled branches reaching up into the dimming sky. I pushed the feeling aside, thinking it was just my imagination. After all, we were in the middle of nowhere, far from civilization. A little silence wasn't anything to worry about. By the time we finished dinner, the last traces of daylight had faded completely. The fire crackled, and we huddled around it, the warmth of the flames pushing back the growing chill. Ryan, ever the entertainer, pulled out a guitar and started strumming a few chords. His voice, rough but melodic, filled the air as we sang along. Zoe and Emma were laughing at something Alex had said, their voices high and carefree. It felt like nothing could ruin this moment, nothing could make us leave this place. But then, the fog started to roll in. At first, it was just a thin, misty haze that hovered at the edge of the clearing, swirling around the trees like smoke. I didn't think much of it. Fog is common in these parts, especially as the night gets colder. But as the minutes passed, the fog grew thicker. It didn't move like regular fog. It seemed to crawl, almost as if it had a mind of its own, creeping across the ground, curling up against the trunks of the trees like tendrils. Is it just me, or is that fog getting weird? Zoe asked, her voice a little quieter than before. I'm telling you, it's fine. Just fog, Ryan replied, clearly not bothered by it. It'll roll out by morning. It's no big deal. But there was something unsettling about the way it moved. It wasn't like any fog I'd ever seen. It wasn't just hanging in the air, it was alive, breathing, shifting. It seemed to get thicker and heavier with every passing minute, swirling around the campfire as though trying to swallow us whole. Okay, this is starting to freak me out, Alex said, standing up and taking a step away from the fire. I don't know what's going on, but this isn't normal. Maybe we should pack it up, I suggested, though my voice was unsteady. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't just the fog, it was the way the forest seemed to press in on us. The trees were closer now, their dark shapes looming in the mist, as if they were watching us. Ryan laughed nervously. Don't be such a baby. It's just fog. But as he spoke, the mist thickened even further, blotting out the trees and the sky. We could barely see beyond the glow of the fire now, the shadows creeping closer with each passing second. The temperature dropped suddenly, the air growing heavy with an unnatural chill that sent a shiver down my spine. I glanced around, my heart beginning to race. The fog wasn't just surrounding us anymore, it was closing in, suffocating the clearing. The fire flickered, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to twist and stretch unnaturally across the ground. I felt a sudden pressure in my chest, like something was pushing against me, forcing the air from my lungs. Something's out there, I whispered, my voice trembling. Ryan, who had been staring into the mist, suddenly stiffened. His eyes widened. What the hell is that? He whispered. I followed his gaze, my breath catching in my throat. The fog had begun to form shapes. Shadows, indistinct at first, but slowly becoming more defined. Figures, tall, gaunt, their limbs twisted and long, slowly emerged from the mist. Their faces were pale, hollow, their eyes black voids of nothingness. They moved in eerie silence, their unnatural presence sending a wave of cold dread crashing over me. Guys, this isn't funny anymore, Emma said, her voice low and shaky. But the figures didn't stop coming. They seemed to circle us, moving just beyond the firelight, their forms shifting in and out of focus as if they were made of smoke or fog itself. The whispers began then, soft at first, like the rustle of dry leaves in the wind. But as they grew louder, I realized they were words, distorted, alien words, speaking in a language I couldn't understand. Luca. I heard, clear as day. My name, whispered from somewhere deep within the mist. My heart slammed in my chest as I turned to look at my friends. Do you hear that? I gasped. They all nodded, their faces pale, their eyes wide with fear. The whispering grew louder, more insistent. The figures in the fog began to move closer, their movements jerky, unnatural. The air around us grew thick, suffocating, as if the very atmosphere was charged with an unseen power. I could feel something watching me. Something more than just the figures in the fog. Something ancient, something hungry. The whispers became a chorus now, all around us, calling our names, beckoning us closer. Luca, come. I didn't think. I just ran. My feet pounded against the soft earth, my lungs burning as I stumbled through the fog. Behind me, I could hear my friends shouting, but the mist was so thick, so disorienting, that I couldn't tell where they were. I couldn't tell where anything was. I ran blindly, crashing through the underbrush, my heart thundering in my chest, the whispers following me, closer with every step. I didn't know how long I ran, or where I was going, but I couldn't stop. I could feel the figures, no, the things, in the fog, drawing nearer. Their presence was suffocating, pressing against me from all sides, like the very air was filled with their hunger. And then, suddenly, it stopped. The fog lifted. I found myself in a small clearing, the mist dissipating like smoke. The air was still, cold, and silent. I looked around desperately, but the forest was empty. The trees stood silent, their branches swaying gently in the breeze, as if nothing had happened. I stumbled back toward the camp, my mind racing, my breath ragged. But when I reached the clearing where we'd set up, I froze. They were gone. My friends, Ryan, Zoe, Alex, Emma, were nowhere to be seen. The fire had burned out, leaving only a ring of cold, blackened ashes. The ground was undisturbed, as if no one had ever been there at all. And then, I heard it. A whisper. Luca, come home. It was their voices, clear now, as if they were standing right behind me. But when I turned, no one was there. Only the trees. Only the fog which had begun to creep in once again. I wasn't alone. I hadn't been alone. And I knew, deep in my gut, that whatever was out there in the woods wasn't finished with me. It would never be finished. And I would never leave the woods again. I stood frozen in the clearing, my heart thumping in my chest, my mind racing. The fog closed in around me once again, thickening like a living thing, as if it could sense my fear, my confusion. The whispers, that haunting chorus, filled the air, a blend of voices I knew, voices I would never forget. Luca, come home. My breath hitched in my throat, but I couldn't move. I had to go. I had to find them, had to wake up from whatever nightmare I was trapped in. But my legs wouldn't obey. It was as if the forest itself had turned against me, holding me in place, forcing me to confront whatever it was lurking within the fog. The mist parted just enough for me to see something in the distance, something moving slowly toward me. My blood ran cold. It wasn't my friends. It was the figures. The things from the mist. They were closer now, their movements slow and deliberate, their faces now twisted, grotesque, their mouths gaping open in silent screams. Their black eyes locked onto mine, their hollow gazes drilling into my very soul. My breath came in shallow gasps, my legs shaking uncontrollably. Please, God, help me, I thought, trying to will myself to move, to escape. But the ground seemed to pull at my feet, the earth itself refusing to let me go. The nearest figure reached out, its long, bony fingers curling toward me, and as they brushed against my skin, I felt a coldness, a darkness that threatened to swallow me whole. I could feel it inside me, pushing into my mind, my very thoughts being pulled away, as if the fog was pulling me into it, making me one with it. And then, the whispers grew louder. More urgent. "Luca, join us." I screamed, the sound tearing from my throat, but it was drowned out by the rising roar of the fog. And then, just when I thought I could bear no more, the figures stopped, their hands freezing in midair. They stood motionless, their heads cocked to the side, as if listening. For a long moment, everything was still. And then, asterisk crack asterisk, the sound of a twig snapping in the distance. I froze, my body tense, straining to hear. There it was again. A rustling. Someone, no, something, moving through the trees. The figures in the mist twitched, their heads snapping toward the sound, and for the first time, I saw fear in their hollow eyes. They began to retreat, backing away, slowly, as if something more powerful had entered the woods. The mist parted, just enough for me to see what was coming. Another figure, towering, cloaked in shadow, its face hidden beneath a hood that seemed to absorb the light. Its presence was overwhelming, oppressive, a force of pure darkness that seemed to push against the very air around me. The figures in the fog scattered, dissolving into the mist as if they were nothing more than fragments of a dream. I didn't dare move. I couldn't. My entire body was locked in place, my heart hammering as the shadowy figure approached. It reached out a hand, its fingers long and pale, but they were not like the other figures. These were not twisted, broken. They were precise, deliberate, full of power. And then, it spoke. "You should not have come," it said, its voice deep, ancient, and filled with sorrow. I tried to speak, but no words came. I couldn't think, couldn't breathe. The figure's presence crushed me, suffocated me, but somehow, it felt like it was protecting me. Keeping me from something worse. I didn't know how long I stood there, trembling, waiting for something to happen. But slowly, the figure withdrew, stepping back into the fog, leaving me standing alone, shivering, broken. The mist began to lift, retreating like a tide pulling back into the ocean. The forest fell silent again. The figures were gone, vanished as though they had never existed. The fire pit where we had gathered was still, cold. The stars above were distant, indifferent. I wanted to scream. I wanted to cry out for my friends, to beg for them to come back. But deep down, I knew the truth. I knew they were gone. And whatever had taken them, whatever had driven them into the mist, was still out there, lurking, waiting for the next fool to wander into its reach. With the fog lifting, I took my first shaky step toward the edge of the clearing, the trees looming like silent sentinels. I glanced back once, toward the place where the figures had stood. The air was still, but the whispering voice of the mist seemed to linger, faint, like a distant memory. "You'll never leave." And I knew it was true. I could never leave. Not really. Not after what I had seen. Not after what I had felt. The forest had claimed me. And in time, it would claim anyone else who dared to walk its haunted paths. I was just another lost soul, trapped in the fog, and it would never let me go. I had always loved the quiet solitude of the last train. There was something peaceful about the empty seats, the soft hum of the engine as it rumbled through the darkened landscape, the world outside fading into shadows. I'd ridden it countless times, back when I was younger, back when it was just another part of my routine. But tonight felt different. I'd missed the earlier trains, had stayed too long at the office, and now here I was, alone on the platform, watching the last one pull in. A strange unease settled in my stomach, but I brushed it off. It was just late-night nerves, nothing more. The platform was silent, the station dimly lit. It was late, far later than I usually stayed out, but I wasn't worried. The train slid to a halt with barely a sound. I watched the doors open in front of me, an invitation to climb aboard. A gust of wind rushed past, but I stepped inside, feeling the warmth of the carriage envelop me. I was the only one there, and for a moment, I enjoyed the rare luxury of solitude. The doors hissed shut behind me, and the train started moving with a low rumble, its wheels clicking steadily against the tracks. I sank into a seat near the window and gazed out at the passing darkness. The landscape blurred by, patches of fog creeping in over fields, the occasional flicker of a distant light. It all seemed so familiar. The same route, the same train. I let out a deep breath, my shoulders relaxing. It had been a long week. The faint hum of the train's engine was comforting, but I noticed something almost immediately. The air felt different. It was colder than usual, and the temperature seemed to drop rapidly as the train gained speed. I wrapped my coat tighter around me, shivering despite the warmth of the carriage. Something in the atmosphere felt thick, like the night itself was pressing down, suffocating. I shook it off. It was just the hour, I told myself. Late at night, things always felt a little off. But then, the lights flickered. It was so brief, almost imperceptible, but I could have sworn the soft glow above me dimmed for a second. When they came back on, the carriages seemed quieter. More empty. I glanced around, but the train was still almost entirely vacant, save for a few passengers scattered throughout. They sat with their heads bowed, their bodies stiff, their faces hidden in shadow. The silence felt heavy, oppressive, like an invisible weight pressing against my chest. I shifted in my seat, but the unease lingered. I couldn't tell if I was imagining it, but I was certain something was off. The train moved faster now, the rhythmic clattering of the tracks quickening. I looked out the window again, but the darkness outside had deepened, the scenery becoming an endless, black void. There were no more fields, no trees, no signs of life. The fog had thickened, swallowing everything beyond the glass. It felt like the train was moving through some kind of endless limbo. Then, something in the corner of my eye caught my attention, a figure in the next carriage. I blinked, surprised to see someone else, as I was certain the car had been empty when I boarded. The man was tall, gaunt, with skin so pale it was almost gray. He stood by the door, staring at me with wide, empty eyes. His face was thin, sharp, like it had been carved from stone. He didn't move, not at first, just stood there watching me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. There was something wrong about him, something unnatural. I quickly looked away, trying to focus on the window, on the passing darkness. But I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still watching me. A few moments passed, and I dared a quick glance back toward him. The man was gone, but the sensation of being watched lingered. My heartbeat quickened as I tried to push the panic down. There was nothing wrong with the train. It was just a late-night ride. Just a late-night ride. But when the doors to the next carriage opened, and a woman stepped inside, I couldn't ignore the prickling on the back of my neck. Her hair was dark, hanging limp over her face like a veil. She didn't look at anyone, didn't make a sound. She walked past me slowly, her footsteps too soft, too deliberate. I tried not to look at her, but her presence filled the space around me like a cold shadow. I shivered again, unsure if it was the cold air or the growing sense of dread tightening around my chest. I focused on the passing darkness outside, trying to ignore the strange murmurs that seemed to come from the other passengers. They weren't speaking, at least not out loud, but I could hear it, as if something was whispering, something I couldn't quite make out. The train slowed for a moment, then lurched forward again with an unsettling jolt. The lights flickered again, but this time, they didn't return to normal. They dimmed, casting long, stretching shadows across the carriages. My pulse hammered in my ears as I looked around. The other passengers, there was no mistaking it now, were staring at me, their eyes too wide, too still. The woman in the seat across from me was no longer just sitting still, her head tilted at an odd angle, her eyes locked on me, unblinking. You're not supposed to be here, she whispered, her lips barely moving. I couldn't tell if she was speaking to me or to someone else. But her voice was wrong. It was hollow, like it had come from somewhere deep inside the earth. I turned my head away, my heart racing. I had to get off. I had to get off this train. I pressed the button to open the door, but nothing happened. The doors were locked, and the panic that had been simmering beneath the surface exploded in my chest. I ran down the aisle to the next carriage, but as I passed the doors, I saw it. The man from earlier, his eyes wide and unblinking, standing completely still in the doorway, as if waiting for me. I tried to scream, but my throat was dry, my breath coming in short gasps. I turned back and rushed down the corridor, stumbling as I went. The train didn't slow down, didn't stop. The landscape outside had disappeared entirely, just a black void of nothing. And then I realized something terrifying, the train was no longer moving toward any destination. It was just moving, endlessly, through an infinite darkness. I heard it before I saw it. A low, scraping sound coming from behind me. I dared to look back and saw that the other passengers were following me now, slow, deliberate steps. Their eyes glowed faintly, unnaturally bright in the dim light, and their mouths stretched into strange, twisted smiles. You can't leave. You can't leave until dawn, they whispered in unison, their voices merging into one. I backed into a corner, my heart hammering in my chest. The train picked up speed, faster now, the sound of the wheels grinding louder in my ears. The air was thick, suffocating. The doors remained locked. There was nowhere to go. The passengers circled around me, their faces pale, their bodies unnaturally still. They had all been waiting, I realized. Waiting for me. The train was moving through a place that had no time, no end. There would be no stops. No escape. The darkness outside pressed in closer, and I knew, with a terrifying certainty, that I would never see daylight again. Until dawn, they whispered again. The train kept moving. And I was trapped. I pressed myself into the corner, my hands trembling, heart pounding wildly in my chest. The passengers, the things were getting closer, their hollow eyes glowing faintly, their lips stretched into twisted smiles. I couldn't tell if I was still dreaming, if I had somehow slipped into a nightmare I couldn't escape. But the way the darkness outside pressed against the windows, the way the train rattled on relentlessly, told me that this wasn't a dream. This was real. And I was trapped. The air had grown thick, suffocating, and the temperature had dropped to a bone-chilling cold. My breath came out in visible clouds, but none of the other passengers seemed to notice. They stood there, unmoving, their eyes fixed on me as if I were the last thing they would ever look at. Until dawn, they whispered again, their voices a chorus that echoed through the carriage. The words felt like a sentence, a prison I would never escape. I tried the doors once more, frantic now, my hands pressing against the cold metal. Nothing. The train didn't slow down, didn't stop. It just kept moving, faster and faster, plunging deeper into an endless abyss. I could no longer tell if the darkness outside was the night, or something else, something far older, more dangerous. I could feel it pressing in on me, suffocating me from all sides. A scream built in my chest, but I couldn't let it out. Not anymore. The passengers were closing in around me, their movements slow but inevitable, like a funeral procession. Then, something changed. The train jerked to a stop, so sudden and jarring that I nearly lost my balance. The lights flickered one last time before going out entirely, leaving us in a deep, impenetrable darkness. The sound of the train's engine died, leaving only the sound of my frantic breathing. For a long moment, I stood there in the dark, listening. The whispers had stopped. The weight of silence pressed down on me, heavier than anything I had ever known. I was alone. Completely, utterly alone. But then, the doors to the carriage opened. I didn't know if it was a trick or if I had somehow finally broken free. The air outside was impossibly still, cold, and I could feel the weight of something terrible waiting just beyond the threshold. But in that moment, a desperate part of me, an instinct I couldn't control, urged me to run. To escape. To get off this cursed train. I stepped forward, my legs shaking, my hands trembling. As I reached for the door, I felt the cold wind on my face, a promise of freedom, or maybe just a new kind of terror. The moment I stepped outside, the door slammed shut behind me with a deafening finality. And I knew, with a horrible certainty, that I would never find my way back. The train was gone, swallowed by the darkness, and as I looked around, the desolate landscape stretched out before me, barren and lifeless. There was no station, no path, no sign of life. Only the cold and the dark. I realized, too late, that the train hadn't been taking me anywhere, it had been leading me here. And no one had ever truly left. The wind howled through the empty void, and I was left standing, alone, in a world without time. Until dawn. I had always been a night owl. The quiet, stillness of the world after dark brought a sense of peace that eluded me during the chaos of daylight hours. I lived alone in a small apartment on the second floor of an old building on the edge of town, a place that felt disconnected from the world around it. But it was this isolation that made my late-night hours feel so serene. At least, they had, until the figure started appearing. It began innocently enough, almost like a fleeting, forgettable dream. Late at night, when I would glance out my window, I'd see what I thought was just a trick of the light, an indistinct form standing just beyond the edge of my vision. At first, I assumed it was a shadow cast by the trees or a passerby, their form swallowed by the darkness. But the next night, the same figure was there again, in the same place, staring at the window, unmoving. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. The shadows, the faint flickers of light, the world just outside my window, it was all so easy to misinterpret. But night after night, the figure returned, as constant as the ticking of a clock. The more I saw it, the more it became a fixture of my existence, like a quiet companion who never spoke but always watched. And then, one night, it moved. I woke up from a restless sleep, my eyes snapping open as I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. The room was dark, as it always was, but something felt different. The air was heavy, like the weight of the world had shifted and settled around me. My heart raced in my chest, and I instinctively turned my head toward the window. At first, I didn't see him. I breathed a sigh of relief, maybe it had all been in my head, maybe I was finally getting some peace. But as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, there he was. Standing closer. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make my breath catch in my throat. The figure, which had always been at the far corner of the yard, now stood just a few feet away from my window. It was as if he had moved silently, inching closer without a sound. His silhouette, tall and thin, stretched out against the backdrop of the dim streetlights, his form perfectly still. I couldn't see his face, not completely, just the outline of his head, his shoulders hunched, as if he were leaning toward me. And the worst part? His position hadn't changed. He wasn't looking up at my window, not directly. He was staring into the darkness ahead, as though he was waiting for something. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that I could feel him. His presence was undeniable, like a weight pressing against the glass, his eyes boring into me even though I couldn't see them. I could sense the intent behind his stillness, the way his gaze seemed to linger, to study me from the darkness. I shuddered. My instinct screamed for me to look away, to hide, but I couldn't tear my eyes off him. Then, as though he had been waiting for my acknowledgement, he moved. It was so slow, deliberate. His head tilted, just slightly, and that small, subtle shift made my heart race. I couldn't look away. I should have. But my body refused to obey. My breath came in shallow gasps as I watched the figure lift one hand, its long fingers stretching out toward me, toward the window, as if reaching through the night itself. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in place. Time seemed to slow. The world outside was silent, unnaturally so. It felt as though the entire universe was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. I couldn't stand it anymore. I had to check the door. I had to know if he was still out there, watching. My legs felt like lead as I moved away from the window, but I couldn't stop myself. Something was drawing me to the door, a terrible need to see, to confirm that I wasn't imagining it. My mind screamed at me to stay inside, to lock the door, to call someone, anyone. But I couldn't. I had to know. I reached the door, my hand trembling as I grabbed the cold brass handle. For a moment, I just stood there, listening to the silence. It was suffocating. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as I pressed my ear to the door, straining to hear anything, any sound that might tell me I wasn't alone. Nothing. I opened the door a crack, just enough to peer into the hallway. Empty. My breath caught, but I told myself it was fine. There was nothing to be afraid of. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That someone, or something, was standing just beyond my door, waiting for the right moment. And then I heard it. A soft, barely perceptible shuffle. A step. No, not a step, a shift. Something moving just outside my door. I flung the door open wide, panic surging through me, my heart pounding in my chest. Nothing. I glanced down the hallway. Still nothing. The shadows clung to the corners like a living thing, but there was no sign of the figure. No sign of anyone. Just emptiness. I slammed the door shut and backed away, my hands shaking uncontrollably. It was just my mind, I told myself. I was tired, running on too little sleep. That's all. But then, something caught my eye. I froze. The window. The figure had moved again. I didn't have to look directly at the window to feel it. I could feel his presence like a growing weight in the air, pressing down on me, suffocating me. The window, the very one I had just turned away from, was now standing directly in front of me. How had he gotten inside? How had he moved so quickly? I didn't dare look back at the window. But I couldn't stop myself from hearing his breath. And I realized in that moment, as I stood there paralyzed in fear, that the worst part of all wasn't how close he had gotten. It was that I could feel him inside my apartment now. That he wasn't just outside. He was already in the room with me. His eyes were on me, even if I couldn't see them. And he wasn't leaving. I stood there, trapped in the heart of my own home, my mind racing for any solution, any escape, but my body was frozen. I was alone, and yet, I wasn't. The figure's presence seemed to fill the room, his invisible weight pressing down on me, suffocating me. I could hear nothing, no sound from the streets, no hum of distant traffic, just the deafening silence that surrounded me. His eyes, though unseen, pierced into me, and I knew without a doubt that he was watching. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. It was as if the air had thickened around me, holding me captive in place. And then, through the silence, I heard it, the faintest whisper. It was barely audible at first, a sound so soft it could have been the wind or the rustle of fabric, but it came again. A voice, low and rasping, like a breath dragged through a dying throat. "You can't hide from me." The words sent a jolt of terror through me, my heart lurching in my chest. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to do something, anything, but my legs wouldn't obey. My mind was spiraling, the walls closing in around me, as the darkness seemed to deepen and stretch. I dared not look toward the window, but my eyes, drawn against my will, glanced in that direction. And there he was. No longer a shadow, no longer just a figure in the night. He stood just inches away from me, his face inches from mine, staring down at me with eyes that glowed with a faint, unnatural light. The shadows that had once hidden him now seemed to crawl over his skin, forming a twisted, monstrous grin. For the first time, I saw his face. It was gaunt, pale, skin stretched too tight across sharp bones. His eyes were black, devoid of life or emotion, and his smile, it wasn't a smile. It was a grotesque mockery of one. His lips curled upward unnaturally, revealing teeth too sharp, too long to be human. "You should have never looked away," he whispered again, and the coldness in his voice sent a shiver down my spine. In that moment, it hit me. This thing, whatever it was, wasn't just watching me. It had been following me, patiently waiting for me to notice, to acknowledge its presence. And now, it was here. It had always been here. In the reflection of the glass, in the shadows of the hallway, in the very air I breathed. His hand reached out, slow and deliberate, his fingers long and impossibly thin. It hovered just inches from my face, trembling slightly as if it knew it was close to its goal. The same hand that had been stretched toward me in the window now hovered above me, and I knew that the moment it touched me, I would never be the same. I backed away instinctively, my feet stumbling over the floor as I turned to run. But the door I had closed just moments ago, was gone. The walls, the ceiling, the floor, all of it had melted into a black void, stretching endlessly before me. There was no escape. The darkness consumed me, pulling me into it, and as I fell, I could hear him behind me, closer than ever. "You're mine now," he murmured, his voice a sickening lullaby. And in that moment, I realized with chilling clarity that I had never been alone in this place. The Watcher hadn't been waiting for me to notice. He had been waiting for me to look away. Now, it was too late. I had always been the type to crave adventure, to seek out the mysteries that most people were too afraid to touch. Growing up in a small town with little to do, I found myself drawn to the stories that floated around the edges of every conversation. And of all the stories, there was one that haunted the town like a dark shadow, the old house at the end of Elm Street. No one ever went near it, not since the fire. Some said it was cursed, others whispered about the strange sounds that could be heard coming from within, even though the house had been abandoned for years. Naturally, that only fueled my curiosity. A house like that? Of course I had to see it for myself. It was a warm, moonless night when I decided to sneak in. My friends dared me, and though I tried to play it off as no big deal, I felt the familiar stir of excitement mixed with fear. I grabbed a flashlight and set off toward the edge of town, the house standing there like a dark sentinel, waiting for me. It was worse than I imagined. The place was falling apart, the windows shattered, the walls crumbling. But that didn't stop me. I had to know. What really lived inside? What made those whispers at night? I would find out tonight. Or so I thought. The yard was overgrown with weeds and wild vines, the once neatly kept garden now a twisted jungle of thorns and brambles. I had to step carefully to avoid snagging my clothes or tripping on the uneven ground. The house loomed ahead, its dark windows like hollow eyes staring out at the world, watching. I couldn't help but feel a strange unease creeping up my spine, but I pushed it aside. I was here to uncover the truth. The front door was already ajar, the wood warped and splintered. It creaked ominously as I pushed it open, stepping inside. The air hit me like a physical force, a damp, musty smell of rot and decay. I swallowed hard, my heart thumping in my chest. The beam of my flashlight flickered for a moment, casting long shadows against the walls of the hallway. Cobwebs clung to the corners, and the floorboards groaned under my weight, warning me that this place wasn't stable. But I didn't care. I was here, and nothing would stop me from exploring. As I moved deeper into the house, I began to hear something, soft, almost imperceptible at first. A whisper. My breath caught in my throat. I stopped dead in my tracks. The air felt thicker now, heavier, as though the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for me to make the next move. I listened closely. The whisper came again, clearer this time. It was a voice, a low murmur, but I couldn't understand the words. It seemed to come from all around me, echoing off the walls. I shook my head. It must have been the wind, I told myself. Maybe the house wasn't as abandoned as I thought. Maybe some animals had made it their home. I pressed on, my feet carrying me further down the hall. The house seemed endless, each room darker and more suffocating than the last. The air grew colder, sending a chill through my body. The whispers were louder now, more urgent, like they were calling to me, begging me to turn back. But I didn't listen. I was too close. I had to know what was going on in this house. I turned a corner and found myself facing a staircase. The wooden steps were worn, some cracked and broken, but they still seemed sturdy enough. Hesitating for only a moment, I began to climb. Each step creaked beneath me, the noise echoing in the silence. The walls seemed to close in around me, the whispers now a chorus of voices, overlapping and indistinct, like 100 people speaking at once. I tried to ignore them, but something about the voices unsettled me. There was a desperate, pleading tone to them now, a hint of terror. When I reached the top of the stairs, I found myself in a long, narrow hallway. Doors lined both sides, but they were all closed, the wood warped and cracked with age. The floor was covered in layers of dust, the air thick with the scent of mildew and rot. I hesitated again, my flashlight scanning each door. None of them seemed to lead anywhere useful. But one door, at the far end of the hallway, caught my eye. It was slightly ajar, a thin sliver of darkness beyond it. The whispers grew louder as I approached, more distinct now. The words were no longer indecipherable. They were a chant, a low, rhythmic sound that seemed to vibrate through my bones. "Don't come in, don't open the door, please." I froze, my hand hovering over the doorknob. My heart raced in my chest, the fear beginning to creep in. But something inside me, something darker and more curious, pushed me forward. I turned the knob and pushed the door open. The room beyond was pitch black. My flashlight flickered and dimmed, casting only weak light that barely illuminated the first few feet of the room. There was a strange smell in the air, like decay, but also something far worse, something metallic, like blood. My breath caught in my throat. I stepped inside, my feet crunching against something soft and sticky on the floor. The beam of my flashlight swept across the room, revealing the source of the smell. There, in the center of the room, was a large, dark shape, covered in tattered blankets. Something was moving beneath them. Something alive. I took a step back, but the door slammed shut behind me with a deafening crash. My heart skipped a beat, and I whirled around, but it was no use. I was trapped. The room was suffocating, the air thick with a sense of dread. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as though the voices were closing in around me. And then, a noise star. A low, guttural groan. The blankets stirred, and something shifted beneath them. I tried to move, to scream, but my voice caught in my throat. My flashlight flickered again, illuminating the thing beneath the blankets. Its skin was pale, stretched tight over bones, its limbs twisted in unnatural angles. And its eyes that glowed a sickly yellow, stared up at me from the shadows, filled with an ancient hunger. I stumbled backward, my legs weak, my mind racing. What was this? What had I uncovered? The creature's mouth opened wide, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. A horrible, rattling sound escaped from its throat. It reached out, its long, skeletal fingers curling toward me. I turned and bolted for the door, slamming into it with all my force, but it wouldn't budge. The creature was closing in, its breathing heavy and ragged. I could hear it shuffling toward me, dragging its twisted body across the floor. And then I heard it, the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, as though someone was walking toward me from the other side of the room. But it wasn't human. It wasn't anything that should exist. I slammed my shoulder against the door again, but it was useless. The house was alive, alive, and it was pulling me into its dark heart. With one final scream, I reached for the handle again. This time, it gave way. The door burst open, and I stumbled into the hall, gasping for air. But the whispers followed. They always followed. And the house wasn't done with me yet. I ran. I didn't think. I didn't look back. My legs carried me down the narrow hallway, each step harder than the last as the house seemed to stretch out endlessly before me, trapping me in its grasp. The whispers were everywhere now, so close, so loud, that they seemed to reverberate in my skull, clawing at my sanity. I could feel the cold breath of whatever was in that room, chasing me, always just behind me. The staircase. I had to make it to the staircase. I could hear the heavy, dragging footsteps getting closer, closer. The floor beneath me felt uneven, like it was shifting with every step I took. I reached the stairs and nearly fell as I rushed down them, my hands gripping the railing for dear life. The house groaned around me, as though it were alive, angry that I was escaping. I didn't know what I was running from, or what I had uncovered, but one thing was certain: something had been living in this house, something that shouldn't have. The front door was so close now, just a few more steps. My pulse thundered in my ears. I reached for the door handle, but before I could turn it, a sharp pain shot through my leg. I screamed, looking down to see cold, bony fingers wrapped around my ankle. The creature. It had followed me. I yanked my foot free, but the door wouldn't budge. It was as though the house itself had sealed me in. My chest tightened, and panic gripped my throat. I pounded on the door, screaming for help, but no one could hear me. The town was far behind, and no one would come. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. In the shadows of the hallway, the creature was crawling toward me, its mouth hanging open, twisted and ragged, filled with rows of teeth that gleamed in the dim light. Its eyes burned with hunger, and it moved faster now, much faster. I shoved my shoulder against the door, desperation flooding me, but it still wouldn't open. The creature's rasping breath was growing louder, drowning out everything else. My skin crawled with the sensation that it was right behind me. And then, finally, the door gave way. I threw myself through it, tumbling out into the overgrown yard, the cold night air filling my lungs like a lifeline. But even as I stumbled away from the house, the feeling of being watched never left me. The house was still there, towering behind me, its dark windows like empty eyes staring into my soul. I didn't stop running until I reached the safety of the town. My legs were on fire, my breath ragged, but I didn't dare look back. Not even once. It's been days since I escaped, and I can still hear the whispers sometimes, especially at night. They call my name, beckoning me back to the house. The house that is alive, that never lets go. I try to tell myself that it's just my imagination, that the adrenaline and fear have played tricks on me. But I know the truth. Something still lives inside that house. And it's waiting. Waiting for the next curious soul to step foot inside. There are some things that you can never explain, things that cling to you, gnaw at you, even when you try to forget. I wish I could say I was imagining it. That it was just some twisted figment of my overactive imagination. But deep down, I know it wasn't. Every night, for as long as I can remember, he's been there. Following. Watching. Waiting. At first, I thought I was just paranoid. A young woman living alone in a big city. You start to get used to the feeling of eyes on you, even when there's no one around. But then, it became something more. Something darker. He wasn't just a stranger lurking in the shadows. He was always there, just beyond the corner, just out of sight, a presence that grew stronger with every passing day. And now, I can't escape him. I've tried everything, locking my doors, installing alarms, changing my routine, but nothing works. He's always there, just a step behind me. A shadow in the dark. And I'm starting to realize that this isn't a coincidence. This isn't a random stalker. No, this is something far older. Something that has been hunting me for years. And tonight, it will finally catch me. It all started on a warm summer evening, just as I was walking home from the bar, the air heavy with the scent of street food and exhaust fumes. The city was alive with noise, cars honking, people laughing, the hum of distant music, and for a moment, I felt safe. But then, I heard it. A slight rustle behind me, so faint it could have been the wind, but I knew better. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I quickened my pace, trying to shake off the feeling, but it only got worse. The footsteps came again, this time closer. Too close. I spun around, heart pounding, expecting to see someone there. But there was nothing. Just the street, the flickering streetlights, and the shadows that seemed to stretch a little longer than they should. I told myself I was being foolish. It was just a bad feeling, right? Maybe a passerby. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The shadows felt wrong. They were darker than they should have been, as if something was lurking just beneath the surface. And that's when I saw him. At first, I didn't recognize him for what he was. He stood at the end of the alley, just beyond the glow of the street lamp, his figure barely visible against the backdrop of darkness. But there was something about him that chilled me to my core. He was too still, too silent. And then, as I stared at him, I realized what was so wrong. His face. Or rather, the lack of one. There was nothing there but smooth, pale skin stretched over an empty void. No eyes, no nose, no mouth, just an abyss where a face should be. I froze. My legs felt like lead, my body locked in place by sheer terror. It wasn't human. It couldn't be. But before I could react, he was gone. I stumbled the rest of the way home, my mind spinning. Could I have imagined it? Was I just tired or too drunk? I tried to convince myself it was nothing, some trick of the light, a fleeting shadow. But the unease gnawed at me. It didn't make sense, and it felt wrong in a way that words couldn't capture. That night, sleep wouldn't come. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind outside sent my pulse racing. I kept checking the locks on my doors, the windows, the hallway outside. But there was no comfort. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of someone, or something, standing just beyond the threshold of my room, waiting for the perfect moment to enter. And when I did finally drift off, I was plagued by nightmares. Dreams of endless corridors, of a faceless figure lurking at every corner. No matter where I went, no matter how fast I ran, he was there, always just behind me, his presence suffocating and inescapable. When I woke the next morning, I thought it was over. But it wasn't. The next night, it happened again. I was walking home, my footsteps echoing in the quiet streets. I told myself to relax, to breathe. It was just my imagination, right? But the moment I turned the corner onto my street, I felt it again. The pressure in the air. The sense of being followed. I glanced over my shoulder, and there he was. This time, I saw him more clearly. He stood just at the edge of the light, his form tall and unnaturally still, his absence of a face even more unsettling in the soft glow of the street lamps. My heart slammed against my chest as I quickened my pace, but when I reached the next corner, he was there too. No matter how fast I walked, no matter which direction I took, he was always just behind me. I turned sharply, trying to throw him off, but as I did, he followed. The coldness of his presence was unbearable, suffocating. I could feel his gaze even though he had no eyes. And that's when I realized, he wasn't just a man. He wasn't even human. He had been following me for years, I realized. It had started as little things, strange coincidences, feelings of being watched, glimpses of him at the edge of my vision. But now, I knew the truth. He wasn't just following me. He was hunting me. Every night, I'd look over my shoulder and see him lurking in the shadows, always waiting for the right moment. Always one step behind. It was as if time itself bent around him. He'd never get closer, never touch me, but I could feel him, the pressure of his gaze like a weight on my shoulders. At first, I tried to tell myself I was overreacting. But when I went to the police, they found nothing. No traces of him, no evidence of stalking. Just my word. And my growing terror. But as the days wore on, the stalking grew worse. His presence became unbearable, always lurking, always near. Sometimes I'd wake up in the middle of the night to find him standing at the foot of my bed, silent, unmoving. I'd close my eyes, hoping it was a dream, but when I opened them, he was still there, watching me. And the worst part? He never moved. Not until the night I saw him up close. I was walking home again, and this time, I knew he was there. I could feel him. I turned the corner, my heart racing, and there he was, right in front of me. Standing under the streetlight, his tall, gaunt figure looming over me. The air felt thick, wrong. My breath caught in my throat as I stared into the void of his face. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The message was clear, he had been waiting for this moment. The silence stretched between us like a chasm. His body was wrong, twisted, as though the very fabric of reality bent to him. His limbs were too long, his posture too rigid, like something that wasn't meant to be seen. And I felt it, felt him, a cold, ancient force that had been hunting me for years. I backed away slowly, but he didn't move. He didn't need to. The shadows around him seemed to reach out, twisting and warping, closing in on me. I ran, and as I did, I realized there was no escaping him. He had been waiting. He had been hunting me for years. There was no corner, no street, no place safe enough to hide. And tonight, I would finally understand the true nature of his pursuit. Because no matter how fast I ran, he was always there, waiting in the dark. And there was no escape. The footsteps behind me never stopped. It was clear now, more than ever, that this wasn't something I could outrun. He was a force older than the world itself, a shadow born from the forgotten corners of time. His presence filled the air, suffocating me, and no matter how much I tried to resist, no matter how far I ran, he was always there. Watching. Waiting. I had become a part of his endless hunt. The night was his, the shadows his domain, and now, so was I. The fear, the terror, it was all part of his plan. And when the moment finally came, when the darkness enveloped me completely, I knew what he would do. I would vanish, swallowed by the very shadows that had haunted me. A mere echo, a forgotten soul. Another lost prey in his endless hunt. And the city, with all its lights and noise, would move on, never knowing the truth, that I had been here, hunted by something far older and far darker than any human mind could comprehend. And he would wait for the next. It was a night like any other. The kind of evening where the streets felt empty, the air carried a crisp chill, and the distant hum of city life seemed muffled by the weight of the fog. I had worked late, as usual, and was making my way home through the park that I often used as a shortcut. The path was familiar, one I had walked countless times before, but tonight felt different. The park was eerily quiet. The usual sounds of rustling leaves or distant voices were absent, replaced by an unsettling stillness that seemed to hang in the air. The only noise was the rhythmic tap of my shoes on the cold, gravel path. I tried to brush off the sense of unease creeping up my spine, chalking it up to the late hour and my overactive imagination. But as I continued down the path, something caught my eye, a gate I hadn't noticed before, almost hidden behind a veil of ivy and forgotten trees. Curiosity piqued, I approached, unsure why something as simple as an old gate would make me feel so uneasy. It wasn't large, nor ornate, just a rusted metal barrier that seemed to have been forgotten by the world. The ivy clung to it like a shroud, masking its presence until now. I reached out, my fingers brushing against the cold iron. The gate creaked as I pushed it open, the sound too loud in the quiet park, breaking the silence like a warning. I stepped inside. The air felt colder here, a stark contrast to the warmth of the streetlights outside. The ground beneath my feet was uneven, and the path was obscured by wild grass and weeds that had overtaken it. The place felt abandoned, forgotten by everyone. I felt a strange pull, a quiet curiosity urging me deeper into this secluded corner of the park. I walked through the overgrown grass, my feet making soft crunching sounds as I moved. The tombstones came into view slowly, their stone faces weathered and covered with lichen, like old memories left to decay in the forgotten corners of the world. But something was wrong. Every single gravestone was identical, plain, unmarked stone. No names. No symbols. Just dates. I stepped closer to one, brushing aside some of the vines that had overtaken it. The date was recent. Far too recent. I glanced at the other stones, the same grim date etched in each one. The dates were from this year, from just a few months ago. My heart began to race as I took a step back, unease gnawing at the edges of my mind. I was certain this cemetery had never been here before. It wasn't on any map I had ever seen of the park, and I had walked these paths countless times. Yet here it was, this graveyard of forgotten souls. A low, distant sound broke the silence. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then it came again, faint cries. A soft, desperate pleading. My body stiffened. The cries sounded human, but they were distant, muffled, like someone in pain. I turned slowly, scanning the rows of identical gravestones. But there was no one. No movement. Just the heavy fog creeping in around me, swallowing the cemetery in its mist. The cries continued, faint but persistent. My feet moved of their own accord, drawn toward the sound. My breath quickened, my pulse racing, but I couldn't stop myself. I took a few hesitant steps forward, glancing around, hoping to find the source. The air around me felt colder, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I reached the edge of the cemetery, the fog thickening, wrapping around me like a suffocating cloak. And then, through the haze, I saw him. A figure standing beside one of the gravestones, hunched over, his hands clutching his chest. He was motionless, like a statue, and for a moment, I thought he might be just another illusion in this strange place. Then he spoke. "Help me," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the fog. His face was pale, gaunt, his eyes wide and filled with a raw terror that sent a chill down my spine. I froze, my body unwilling to move. Something about the way he spoke, the desperation in his voice, felt wrong. His eyes locked onto mine, and I could see the fear there, raw, primal fear. It was as if he were pleading for something, or someone, to save him from something I couldn't even begin to understand. "Get out," he rasped, his voice barely a breath now. "Leave this place, before it's too late." Before I could ask what he meant, before I could even react, he suddenly lurched forward, his form flickering in and out like a fading shadow. His body seemed to dissolve into the mist, and in an instant, he was gone, vanished without a trace. I stood there, heart pounding in my chest, unsure of what I had just witnessed. The cries for help stopped as suddenly as they had started, leaving behind only an oppressive silence that seemed to press in from all sides. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Who was that man? Why had he been here? And why did he warn me to leave? I took a step backward, the weight of the air pressing down on me, and that's when I realized something terrifying. The cemetery, this forgotten place, was changing. The rows of gravestones that had once stretched out before me now seemed to curve, their shapes shifting and warping, as though the very ground beneath my feet was alive, breathing, shifting in ways it shouldn't. The gate, the path I had entered through, was no longer visible. I had become lost in this place, trapped in a nightmare I couldn't escape. Panic surged through me, and I began to run. My feet pounded against the uneven ground, my breath coming in short, desperate gasps. The fog seemed to close in, thick and suffocating, and I couldn't see more than a few feet in front of me. Behind me, I heard the sound of footsteps, faint, but unmistakable. Someone, or something, was following me. I glanced over my shoulder, my heart hammering in my chest, but there was nothing. Just the swirling fog and the ever-looming presence of the gravestones. I forced myself to keep running, desperate for an escape, but it was as if the cemetery was shifting around me, trapping me in its endless maze. Finally, I broke through the mist. The park was ahead, the faint glow of streetlights breaking through the fog like a lifeline. I didn't dare look back. I just ran until the sound of my footsteps on the gravel was the only noise that filled my ears. The air around me finally felt warmer, but the terror still clung to me, refusing to let go. I didn't stop until I was home. The door slammed shut behind me, and I locked it, my breath ragged and uneven. I sat there, trembling, staring out the window at the fog that seemed to linger in the streets below. But it wasn't just the fog that haunted me. It was the memory of that man, of his terrified eyes, of his warning. The memory of the cries for help that still echoed in my mind, unanswered. When I looked at the clock on the wall, my heart sank. The date on the screen was the same as one of the gravestones. The same as the date etched in cold stone. It was the date of my own death. And I wasn't sure if I had just escaped, or if I was still trapped in that forgotten cemetery, waiting for the next cry for help to come. I spent the rest of the night in a restless haze, unable to shake the images from the cemetery, those identical gravestones, the man's hollow eyes, and the eerie cries that seemed to follow me even after I had left. The warmth of my home did little to ease the chill that had seeped deep into my bones. My mind raced in circles, desperately trying to make sense of what had happened, but there was no explanation that made sense. By morning, I hoped it had all been a nightmare. That the fog, the cries, the man had been nothing more than a product of exhaustion, a hallucination brought on by too many late nights and too much stress. But when I stepped outside to face the daylight, the unease didn't leave me. I looked toward the park, hoping to see the familiar path where I had walked countless times before. But there was nothing. No gate. No overgrown cemetery. Nothing to suggest that what I had experienced was anything but a twisted dream. I tried to tell myself that it had been a figment of my imagination, that it was over, but the date on the gravestones haunted me. I couldn't escape it. I glanced at my phone again, and the number flashed before my eyes, * today's date star. And there, in the small corner of the screen, was the one thing I had feared the most. The date matched. The same exact date. The same numbers that had been etched in the stone of the cemetery. I was numb with terror. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at the date, or how much time had passed. But when I finally forced myself to look up, I knew, * I had never left, * the cemetery was still with me, like a shadow that clung to my every step, a curse that had attached itself to my soul. The fog had returned, though this time it wasn't a natural mist rolling over the park. No, this time, it was closer. Almost suffocating. And I knew, with an eerie certainty, that it was waiting for me. Waiting for me to return. I didn't want to go back, but I knew I had no choice. The cries for help would be there, pulling me in once more, and the gravestones, those identical, cursed markers, would be waiting. And somewhere, deep in that fog, the man would be waiting too, his desperate eyes watching as I crossed the threshold. Because once you've walked into the forgotten cemetery, it doesn't let you go. Not ever. I'm still there, somewhere. Or at least, I think I am. I hear the cries in my dreams now, echoing, pleading for me to return, as if I could ever truly escape. Maybe I've never left at all. But one thing is certain. The forgotten cemetery is never truly forgotten. And it will find you.